Most people believe that a narcissist only collapses when they are exposed, abandoned, or when someone finally defeats them. But that belief misses a far more uncomfortable truth. The narcissist is not destroyed by others, but by the very psychological structure that allows them to survive. Their collapse does not begin with loss, betrayal, or external karma. It begins much earlier, in silence, in success, and in moments when everything appears to be functioning perfectly. What looks like confidence is often just compensation. What looks like control is, in reality, fear held together by habit. And what looks like power, in many cases, is nothing more than a borrowed identity, one that cannot exist without constant external reinforcement. From the outside, a narcissist's life may appear impressive. Influence, admiration, charisma, relentless momentum. But psychology is not concerned with surfaces. It is concerned with what a system requires in order to keep operating. And the narcissistic system is fragile at its core. It depends on reflection, reaction, and regulation from the outside world. When even one of these elements weakens, cracks begin to form, not loudly, not dramatically, but persistently. The narcissist does not collapse because something goes wrong, but because there is nothing inside them stable enough to stand on its own. This is where depth psychology becomes essential. As Carl Jung pointed out, the parts of the psyche that are denied, split off, or projected outward do not disappear. They accumulate. They build pressure, and eventually they turn inward. The shadow does not attack from the outside, it erodes from within. For the narcissist, whose identity is built almost entirely from masks and performance, this erosion is not experienced as awakening, but as anxiety, emptiness, and an ever-growing need to control what can no longer be stabilized internally. What makes this process surprising and tragic is that the narcissist rarely realizes it is happening. They interpret consequences as betrayal, isolation as bad luck, the loss of influence as injustice. They cannot see a pattern, because seeing it would require self-reflection, and self-reflection threatens the very structure they rely on to exist. So instead of changing, they accelerate. More control, tighter image management, greater distance from reality. Every attempt to protect the ego inadvertently tightens the noose, slowly, invisibly, but irreversibly. This is not a story about punishment or moral failure, nor is it about bad people getting what they deserve. It is a story about psychological gravity, about what happens when a person builds a life without an inner core, without the capacity to tolerate vulnerability, and without integrating their own shadow. The narcissist does not wake up one day and choose self-destruction. They walk a path that makes every other outcome impossible while still believing they are winning. And this is the paradox we are about to examine in depth. The most devastating collapse is the one that unfolds while a person still believes they are in control of everything. Part 1. The false self and the foundation cracked from the very beginning. The starting point of the narcissist's self-destruction does not lie in behavior, but in the ego structure they build in order to survive. From the beginning, their self does not form through inner self-awareness, but through the reflection of the external world. They learn to become who others need, who others admire, who the gaze of the crowd confirms as valuable. And in that moment, a dangerous foundation is laid. Their identity is not something they possess, but something they must constantly maintain. In Carl Jung's depth psychology, this is the state in which the persona, the social mask, ceases to be a tool of communication and becomes the primary residence of the ego. When this happens, a person no longer wears the mask, they live inside it. And anything that threatens that mask is experienced as a threat to survival itself. The narcissist does not protect the image because they love it, but because without it, they do not know who they are. On the surface, this structure appears effective. It produces charisma, success, influence, and a sense of control. But beneath it lies a fatal weakness. It cannot stand on its own. An ego built from reflection requires constant reflection. A borrowed self requires continuous interest payments in the form of attention, admiration, and reaction from others. And this turns the narcissist's entire life into a maintenance system rather than a lived experience. This is why they cannot stop, cannot be still, cannot simply be themselves. Silence does not bring them peace. It brings panic. The moment they are no longer seen, no longer responded to, no longer affirmed, they begin to feel an almost unnameable void, a hollow, unanchored sensation, as if the self itself were dissolving from the inside. This is not ordinary sadness. It is existential fear. If no one reflects me, do I exist at all? And to avoid facing that question, the narcissist does the only thing their structure allows. They intensify the performance. They exert more control. They manage their image more tightly. They manipulate the narrative more skillfully. What they do not realize is that every new layer of persona they construct simultaneously pushes the denied parts of themselves, weakness, fear, shame, insecurity, deeper into the shadow. And the shadow does not disappear when it is buried. It only becomes heavier. At this stage, self-destruction is not yet visible. The surface remains polished. Achievements continue. Others are still drawn in. But internally, a dangerous paradox is forming. The more successful the narcissist becomes at maintaining the false self, the further they move from any capacity to build a real one. They become the manager of their own image, rather than a person living inside their own life. And this is why the narcissist's collapse is not an accident. It is the logical consequence of an identity without a core. A structure may be tall, even dazzling, but if its foundation is built on denial and borrowed substance, its collapse is only a matter of time, not if, but when. Part 2. Addicted to control. When power becomes the ego's life support. When the ego is built on a borrowed foundation, control is no longer a choice. It becomes a condition for survival. For the narcissist, control is not merely the desire to influence or direct situations. It is the mechanism that keeps them from collapsing. Control gives them a sense of boundary, form, and position. Without control, they fall into a state they cannot tolerate, facing themselves without the protective layer of external reflection. This is why control spreads into every area of life. They control the rhythm of relationships, the emotions of others, the narrative being told, even how others are supposed to feel about them. The danger does not lie in how skillful their control is, but in the fact that they can no longer exist without it. This is the point at which power transforms into dependency. Within Carl Jung's psychological framework, when the ego relies entirely on the persona for its identity, anything that cannot be controlled is experienced as an intrusion of the shadow. Surprise, contradiction, negative feedback, difference, none of these remain information to be learned from. They become threats that must be neutralized. As a result, the narcissist does not navigate life. They defend themselves against it. At first glance, this pattern creates the illusion of stability. Everything appears to be under control. Others respond in the right way. Order is maintained. But beneath the surface, a silent cost is being paid. Each time control replaces connection, another opportunity to build genuine inner safety is lost. Each time manipulation replaces dialogue, another thread linking them to reality is cut. And each time they win through power, they lose through depth. What the narcissist fails to realize is this: control never provides lasting certainty. It only delays collapse by pushing the system closer to its limits. A living world cannot be frozen indefinitely. Human beings cannot be controlled without generating resistance. And reality, sooner or later, will push back against every attempt to lock it into a single script. When this resistance begins to appear in the form of fatigue, distance, silence, or reactions that are no longer predictable, the narcissist does not read it as a signal to adjust. They read it as betrayal. And their instinctive response is not to listen, but to tighten their grip. More control, more pressure, deeper violations of other people's boundaries. This is the moment when power begins to turn back and bite the one who wields it. A profound paradox forms here. The more they try to control in order to avoid inner chaos, the more chaos they create externally. The more they need order to feel safe, the more tense and unsustainable their environment becomes. And when those around them begin to withdraw, not through confrontation, but through silence and departure, the control system suddenly loses its critical points of support. It is here that the process of self-destruction accelerates. Not because they lose power in a single moment, but because the only tool they know how to use to survive no longer works. Control no longer brings stability. It only exposes the emptiness they have been trying to conceal. And when power can no longer function as the ego's life support, the quiet panic that has long been held at bay begins to rise to the surface. The next section will show what happens when the shadow, suppressed for too long by control, begins to leak outward through behaviors that appear harmless, but are in fact signs of a structure entering severe imbalance. Part 3. When the shadow begins to leak. Collapse is no longer invisible. There is no moment when a narcissist decides to reveal their true nature. The leakage of the shadow does not occur as an explosion, but as a hairline crack on the surface, quiet, repetitive, and increasingly difficult to conceal. When control is no longer sufficient to keep the system stable, the parts buried for too long begin to force their way outward. Not because the narcissist wants them to, but because the inner structure has exceeded its threshold of endurance. In Carl Jung's depth psychology, the shadow is not evil, but the part of truth excluded from consciousness. When the ego refuses dialogue with it, the shadow does not disappear, it simply changes its mode of expression. In narcissists, this leakage often shows up through behaviors that seem entirely ordinary. Disproportionate irritability, sudden contempt, remarks that wound others but are disguised as honesty or excessive defensiveness in response to things that should have been harmless. What is striking is that these reactions are not experienced by the narcissist as loss of control, but as necessity. In their perception, the world is becoming irritating, disrespectful, no longer cooperative as it once was. They do not see themselves leaking. They only feel provoked. And this distorted interpretation gives the shadow more space to expand. As the shadow begins to leak, the surrounding environment is the first to notice. Those who once felt drawn in begin to feel uneasy. Those who once tried to please begin to feel exhausted, not because of one major incident, but because of an accumulation of small signals, inconsistent speech, abrupt emotional shifts, increasingly obvious manipulation, and an atmosphere of tension that is difficult to name. This is the moment when other people's intuition starts to activate, even if they do not yet have language for what they are sensing. For the narcissist, others' reactions are now experienced as yet another loss of control, and the familiar reflex returns. They attempt to tighten their image even further. What they fail to realize is that once the shadow has begun to leak, the persona no longer has the strength to contain it. Each attempt at impression management becomes stiff, unnatural, even counterproductive. The strain begins to show, and it is precisely this strain that causes others to pull away. Another paradox forms here. The more the narcissist tries to prove that they are fine, right, above it all, the more they signal the opposite. Not because they have become weaker, but because they are expending increasing amounts of energy to conceal what can no longer be concealed. The shadow, when not integrated, does not merely leak, it begins to take over space. At this stage, self-destruction has moved from the inside to the outside. It is no longer just quiet anxiety or hidden emptiness. It begins to directly affect relationships, reputation, and the living environment. Things that were once overlooked now become problems. People who were once silent begin to create distance. And most dangerously, the narcissist does not understand why this is happening. Instead of reading this as a signal to pause, to reflect, they read it as proof that the world is turning against them. And it is precisely this interpretation that pushes them into the next phase of self-destruction, selective self-isolation, where they eliminate those who reflect truth and keep only favorable mirrors. But this, as we will see, is not a solution. It is the final act of locking the door on a structure that is imprisoning itself from within. Part 4. Self-isolation. When the narcissist builds a prison for themselves, when the shadow has begun to leak and the persona no longer has the strength to contain it, the narcissist enters a survival reflex. They narrow their world, not by withdrawing completely, but through selective isolation. Those who make them uncomfortable, challenge the story they tell about themselves, or simply no longer reflect the desired role, are gradually removed from their orbit. No major conflict is required. Silence, coldness, or a sufficiently reasonable excuse is enough to justify the exclusion. On the surface, this decision appears as strength and self-mastery. Narcissists often label it setting boundaries, being selective about relationships, or not tolerating negativity. But at the level of psychological structure, something very different is happening. They are cutting off mirrors that reflect truth, keeping only those that do not destabilize the ego. And it is here that the trap closes. In depth psychology, when a system eliminates real feedback, it does not become more stable, it becomes blind. As Carl Jung emphasized, the ego can mature only through dialogue with what is opposing and uncomfortable. When this dialogue is severed, the self does not grow, it contracts. And that contraction is not experienced as weakness, but as maintaining order. The result is an environment increasingly impoverished of truth. Those who remain are often people who do not challenge, do not reflect, or are dependent on the power structure the narcissist creates. At first, this brings relief. No more conflict, no more challenges, no more need to face shame or insecurity. But this quiet is not peace, it is the absence of information. It is precisely within this falsely safe space that self-destruction accelerates. Without real feedback to correct behavior, the narcissist begins to believe absolutely in their own narrative. Every failure is someone else's fault. Every distance is betrayal. Every loss is injustice. And because no one remains close enough to reflect a different perspective, that narrative becomes the only reality they know. A bitter paradox forms. They isolate to feel safe, yet that very isolation makes them more vulnerable than ever. When the world is narrowed, every small change feels threatening. When support networks are reduced, every loss feels annihilating. And when no one remains close enough to touch the truth, the shadow, rather than being integrated, begins to occupy the entire inner space. At this stage, narcissists often complain that no one understands me anymore, that people have become increasingly ungrateful, incompetent, or unworthy. What they fail to see is the causal link. By removing those capable of genuine dialogue, they have rendered their world impoverished, tense, and fragile. They are not abandoned. They have closed the door from the inside. And once the prison is built, with walls constructed from control, denial, and self-justification, self-destruction takes on a new form, self-sabotage. With no one left to blame directly and no feedback to recalibrate, energy begins to turn inward. Poor decisions, burned bridges, the destruction of what was once built not due to lack of ability, but because the system has lost its capacity to self-regulate. The next section will explore this loop in depth. How the narcissist unconsciously destroys the very achievements, relationships, and positions they once depended on to survive, and why they call it bad luck, when in reality it is the inevitable outcome of a structure that has locked itself away from truth. Part 5. Self-sabotage. When energy turns back on itself, when the external world has been narrowed and the mirrors that reflect truth have been removed, the energy once used to control others does not disappear. It turns inward, and that is the moment the narcissist begins to destroy what they once relied on to survive, not in a dramatic outburst, but through small, poorly timed, inconsistent, and increasingly baffling decisions. Self-sabotage in narcissists rarely appears as, "I want to ruin everything." It shows up as an unnamed restlessness, a sudden urge to change, a need to tear something down before it becomes too real. Because when an achievement begins to stabilize, when a relationship begins to develop depth, it demands what the narcissistic structure cannot provide: genuine presence, the capacity to tolerate vulnerability, and the admission that they do not control everything. Rather than facing that demand, the narcissist chooses a more familiar path: disruption, an impulsive decision, a remark that fractures trust, a move that destabilizes the entire system. And then comes the performative surprise: "I don't understand how things ended up this way." Yet, at a deeper level, the behavior is not random. It is the only way to avoid remaining in a reality where the persona can no longer offer protection. From a Jungian perspective, when the ego refuses to integrate the shadow, psychic energy must find an outlet. If it is not transformed into awareness, it becomes behavior. And behavior without inner dialogue is often destructive. The narcissist does not destroy because they are weak. They destroy because they have no safe place to set their truth down. A common expression of self-sabotage is the destruction of important relationships just before they become stable. Not because the other person has done something gravely wrong, but because intimacy begins to activate the fear of being seen through. Instead of naming that fear, the narcissist chooses to wound, provoke conflict, or withdraw coldly. When the relationship collapses, they can return to the familiar role: the victim of betrayal, the one who was misunderstood. End quote. Similarly, in work or social standing, self-sabotage emerges through decisions that erode credibility: underestimating risk, dismissing feedback, or breaking essential alliances, not due to incompetence, but because maintaining a stable structure would require sharing power, accepting limits, and listening acts that contradict the defensive system they have depended on for too long. The irony is that after each act of self-sabotage, the narcissist experiences a brief sense of relief. The pressure to maintain a flawless image temporarily lifts. Others' expectations vanish. Complex reality is simplified into a familiar narrative: "I've been treated unfairly again." But this relief is not healing, it is emptiness reaffirmed. And so the cycle repeats. Achievements are rebuilt, new relationships are formed, new images are constructed, until reality once again demands genuine presence and self-sabotage is triggered again. Each cycle not only harms others, but renders the narcissist's inner structure thinner, less flexible, and more brittle. At this stage, self-destruction has become an unconscious way of life. No external enemy is required, no major catastrophe is needed, only time. And time, when paired with a structure incapable of self-adjustment, will always lean toward collapse. Part 6. Anxiety and emptiness. The truth they cannot bear. After repeated cycles of control, leakage, isolation, and self-sabotage, the narcissist finally reaches the state they have always tried to avoid: chronic baseline anxiety and a sense of emptiness that cannot be filled. This is not anxiety about a specific event, nor sadness with a clear cause. It is a low-grade, persistent feeling, as if something is fundamentally wrong at the core of existence, yet without language to name it. What is crucial to understand is this: this anxiety does not originate in the external world. It does not arise from failure, abandonment, or loss of power. It emerges because the defensive system has been operating for too long and no longer has the energy to sustain itself. When the persona can no longer shield the ego, when control no longer provides a sense of safety, the ego is forced to face a void it has never learned how to inhabit. From Carl Jung's perspective, emptiness is not the absence of value, but the sign of an ego that has not been individuated, a self that was never built from within. For the narcissist, this is especially terrifying because they have no inner home to return to. When external reflection disappears, they do not find stillness. They encounter disintegration. Anxiety thus becomes the default state. They are hyper-alert to every small change. A delayed reply, a different look, a response that lacks enthusiasm. Any of these can trigger a sense of threat. Not because such events are severe, but because the system has lost its capacity for self-regulation. Without a stable inner core, every fluctuation is experienced as an existential risk. Emptiness also does not appear as peaceful quiet. It shows up as restlessness, boredom, and the feeling that it is never enough. The narcissist may stay constantly busy, endlessly seek stimulation, or continually generate drama, not because they enjoy chaos, but because silence forces them to face the inner void. And that void, for them, is unbearable. It is at this stage that behaviors that seem baffling begin to emerge. Sudden changes, desperate attention-seeking, unnecessary conflict, or frantic pursuit of new goals without direction. These actions are not meant to create genuine joy or achievement. They serve only to disrupt anxiety, to temporarily fill emptiness with movement. But baseline anxiety does not disappear when it is filled with activity. It is merely pushed aside and returns with greater force. Each cycle drains more energy, tolerance diminishes, self-regulation weakens, and the experience they fear most, loss of control, becomes increasingly frequent. At the deepest level, anxiety and emptiness are messages from the psyche. It is time to face the self. But for the narcissist, this message is not read as an invitation to transformation. It is perceived as a threat to be avoided. So instead of turning inward, they turn outward, seeking more validation, more power, more reaction. And this avoidance tightens the loop of self-destruction. There is no way to soothe existential anxiety without building a real identity. There is no way to fill emptiness without accepting vulnerability. And there is no escape from self-destruction as long as the ego treats inner truth as an enemy. Part 7. Addicted to validation. When the ego loses its source of nourishment, when baseline anxiety and emptiness become permanent states, the narcissist turns to the solution they have always relied on to survive: external validation, not as a desire, but as a survival need. At this stage, attention is no longer pleasure or reward. It becomes the only way they can feel that they still exist. The paradox is this: the weaker the inner core, the more reflection they need to keep the ego from dissolving. One compliment is no longer enough. A look of admiration brings only momentary relief. Soon after, the emptiness returns deeper, colder. And because they do not understand that the problem lies in the inner structure, the narcissist interprets this emptiness as proof that they have not been validated enough. So the dosage increases. They seek new stages, new people, new contexts in which to be seen. Relationships are no longer built on an encounter between two human beings, but on the reflective value the other person provides. Those who admire are kept. Those who are indifferent or ask questions are discarded. relationships become increasingly instrumentalized and therefore increasingly fragile. Within Carl Jung's framework, this is the inevitable consequence of an ego that has not been individuated. When the self lacks an inner foundation, it must borrow value from the outside. But borrowed value is never sufficient, because it does not belong to the borrower. And every time the supply is interrupted even slightly, the narcissist experiences a sensation of free fall. At this stage, people around them begin to feel that they are no longer seen as human beings, but as sources. Their presence has value only insofar as it reinforces the narcissist's image. This creates a quiet exhaustion, always having to respond correctly, admire correctly, pay attention correctly, and when people cannot live indefinitely in that role, they begin to withdraw. Each withdrawal strikes an already fragile system. But instead of pausing to reflect, the narcissist accelerates the search. They may become more flamboyant, more dramatic, or more desperate in holding attention, not because they have become worse, but because the system is starving. And a starving system cannot distinguish between what is nourishing and what is destructive. It only knows that it must be fed. The most devastating aspect of validation addiction is that it completely erodes the capacity to build real value. When everything is measured by external reaction, there is no space for silence, for slow growth, for staying with uncomfortable emotions. And those are precisely the foundations of a stable identity. In the relentless effort to be seen, the narcissist loses the only chance to truly see themselves. By this point, the loop of self-destruction is nearly complete. Validation no longer nourishes. It only prolongs depletion. Relationships no longer soothe. They become pressure. And the ego, rather than being strengthened, becomes increasingly dependent and fragile. Yet this is not the end, because when the addiction can no longer be satisfied, the narcissist is forced to confront what they have always avoided, the consequences of their own actions.